Hey, it's Mr. Omi again, once again, taking the mystery out of history. Today we're going to talk about the different regions of colonies and how they were different socially and economically. It's amazing to think geography and climate really shape who lives where and how they make money. Things like climate, soil conditions, and other natural resources will shape regional economic development, meaning, again, depending on what the weather's like or what the soil's like, is going to determine how you make money in the colonies. So, there are three major groups of colonies: New England colonies, Middle colonies, and Southern colonies. The New England colonies are made up of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The Middle colonies are Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. And then lastly, in the South, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Those are much easier to remember and much easier to identify on a map. Will you have to identify all these on a map? Yes. Yes, you will. But we'll do that map in class. So, here's a Puritan woman. Also, I think this is a poster for the new Powhatan High School dress code, ladies. New England colonies. Let's talk about their economy, how they make money. The New England colonies developed an economy based on shipbuilding, fishing, lumbering, small-scale subsistence farming, and eventually manufacturing. Well, what does that mean? Look over here on the right, where it says poor soil, fast rivers, short growing seasons, natural harbors, and a long coast dictated this economy. See, that will determine how they make money. So if the soil is poor, they're not going to have large plantations to grow cash crops like down in the south. So they will still have farms, but they're called subsistence farms, meaning just enough to exist. You can grow enough food for you and your family, maybe a little bit to sell in the market, but it's not a huge plantation where you're exporting crops. All of these natural harbors are going to lead them to build ships and fishing. Whaling is a huge thing. So the colonies prospered, also reflecting the Puritans' strong belief in hard work and thrift. We talked about that. So you can see that in the New England colonies. They're also very religious. We know the Puritans believe in the very pure faith, and they were intolerant of others who didn't believe what they believed. The irony is, and we've talked about this too, that they were driven out of England because people were intolerant of their beliefs. They were too strict for England. They come here, yet if you came to their colonies and didn't quite worship the way they did and follow their rules, they would kick you out. Here's a picture of the Salem witch trials, and you probably have read about this or know about this, that again, very intolerant of others. So if you didn't believe what they believed, and you're like, "What's up, Puritans, party people, let's go," they're like, no, you must leave here and go somewhere else. You could go to Rhode Island. Rhode Island was founded by religious dissenters fleeing persecution by the Puritans in Massachusetts. Dissenters, well, that's a great word. If you dissent, that means you disagree. And I'm thinking you probably dissent with your parents fairly often, so. Here's William Penn, founder of the Pennsylvania Quakers, founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, and a safe place for Quakers. Hey, you ever seen the Quaker oatmeal guy? Yeah, he looks a little bit like that guy. In the Middle colonies, they developed economies based on shipbuilding, small-scale farming, and trading. More trade. See, in New England colonies, it's more shipbuilding and fishing and manufacturing. In the Middle, it's more trade, because they do still have a lot of harbors, but they also have better land, and they can grow a lot of crops too, especially in Maryland. Maryland sometimes is considered a southern colony, but the SOL said it's a middle colony. They also have these huge commercial centers, New York and Philadelphia, commercial centers. Well, when you think of a commercial on TV, what are they doing? They're selling you something, right? So commercial centers are places where things are bought and sold on large scale. And New York and Philadelphia will be large commercial centers. They're also home to different groups. We said, in New England, the Puritans are there, and other religious groups too, but they're fairly intolerant. So, differently in the Middle colonies, they're more open to different religious groups. Quakers in Pennsylvania, you find Jews and Huguenots in New York, and Presbyterians in New Jersey. More flexible social structures, and began to develop a middle class of skilled artisans, entrepreneurs, business owners, and small farmers. Easy to remember, there's a middle class in the Middle colonies. And the small businessman kind of appears here too. Well, let's move down south. Virginia, there's Jamestown. We know it's founded in 1607, right? In the eastern coastal lowlands, those are where you find your large plantations of cash crops, things like tobacco, rice, and indigo. I know. People picture rice and like rice paddies in Asia, but they grew rice in the swamplands in the south too. Now, if you remember before, we talked about the Virginia Cavaliers. Those were the wealthy people that got free land from the king. This is where their land is. We said this is the good land. But remember, we said if you were poor, you didn't dilly-dally. You had to keep on walking to the Shenandoah Valley. Well, if you were poor, you went farther into the Appalachian foothills. And that's where you had your, again, subsistence farm, a small farm, and hunting and trading. Still like that today. Still like that today. The social structure was based on family status and ownership of land. What does that mean? If your family owned a plantation, you inherited that plantation. Your children would inherit that plantation. There is still, we talk about old money in the South. There are still good, huge Southern families here in the South that can trace their roots back to the very beginning. So wealth is passed on through family, and based on your family status, it was how much land you owned and how much wealth you had. So large landowners in the eastern lowlands dominated colonial government and society and maintained an allegiance to the Church of England and closer social ties to England than the other colonies. Well, again, the Puritans aren't going to have really close ties to England because they pretty much got kicked out. Cavaliers get free land from the king. They love the king. They have a good relationship. The Church of England is the king's church, so they're going to worship in his church, and they're going to maintain those ties. When the Revolution comes, the American Revolution, it really starts in New England. It's easy. It's harder to get the Virginians to come along and join the fight, but we know there's a guy named Patrick Henry that's going to help convince him. So in the mountains and valleys further inland, however, society was characterized by small subsistence farms. Again, small farms, right, just for enough for you and your family, hunters and traders. But these are particularly Scots-Irish and English descent. So that's where the more poor people are. Again, the plantation-based agriculture in the hot, humid coastal lowlands of the southern colonies required cheap labor on large scale. We need a lot of workers, right? And there are not enough gentlemen here to do it. I don't think they're going to do it anyway. So we said the natives often were affected by disease and pushed off the land, so they're going to have to get a workforce from somewhere else. One is indentured servants. We already talked about that too. You can work for a few years and pay off your debt, and those were poor people, particularly from England, Scotland, or Ireland. Some of them were actually the first Africans when they arrived were indentured servants, and they were freed, and they eventually had their own land. But soon after that didn't last very long. Africans will come as slaves. So most plantation labor eventually needs a lot of labor, and it will be filled by the forcible importation of Africans. Some Africans, we said just a minute ago, worked as indentured servants and earned their freedom and lived as free citizens during colonial life. That didn't last long. Most of them came against their will. So over time, larger and larger numbers of enslaved Africans were forcibly brought here on the Middle Passage. And we'll map this in class and talk much more about it and how terrible it was. The development of slavery-based agricultural economy in the southern colonies would lead to eventual conflict between the North and South, we know in the American Civil War. So again, when I started this slide presentation, we talked about geography and climate shapes everything. It still affects life today in America. Slavery takes hold in the South. Why? Because there's good land, and there are cash crops grown there, and they need a labor force. That's why slavery's in the South. Slavery doesn't exist as much in the South. In the North. There are slaves in the North, but not as much because the soil's not so good. It's manufacturing, shipbuilding, fishing, not huge farms, small subsistence farms. And that'll divide the North and South. Later on, there's going to be a religious movement called the Great Awakening. Remember, the Puritans come here for religious freedom, and they are very strict. Well, after a few generations, the kids and the grandkids aren't going to church anymore, starting to smoke tobacco, maybe drink a little rum. They're falling back on their beliefs. So this kind of comes through the colonies. These preachers walk around and travel around and give these fiery sermons to try to get people back to their roots, basically. And it's going to lead to the rapid growth of evangelical religions, such as Methodists and Baptists. If you've ever been to some of these churches, or you happen to be a Baptist or Methodist, some of the sermons get pretty fiery. And it's based on preaching. And it'll start to challenge established religions and, this is very important, to governmental order. It's going to lay the foundations of the American Revolution. People are beginning to say, if life, liberty, and the right of property come from God, how can the king take that away? And those ideas those seeds are planted in the Great Awakening. So there's Jonathan Edwards. We'll talk about him. I'm going to read a sermon to you telling you basically how terrible you are and you're a bad sinner, and unfortunately you're probably going to go to hell. Common themes in all these colonies: the notion of private property and free enterprise, Again, all of them believed that we should own property and free enterprise, meaning buying and selling of goods, a free market. That, if you were poor, typically you stayed poor in England. Here you had more opportunity to rise and become upper class. And pretty much each colony had some form of self-government, meaning white males, and particularly white property-owning males, had a say in government. Got it?